The greatest lies are never hidden in darkness. They are celebrated in broad daylight until no one remembers the truth. The bells of the royal capital echoed across the valley as thousands of citizens gathered before the towering white stone palace to celebrate the 18th anniversary of the Kingdom of Evermont's founding day. Bright banners danced in the morning breeze. Musicians filled the streets with triumphant melodies, and merchants lined every avenue with colorful displays of food, flowers, and handcrafted treasures. Every family believed they were witnessing another glorious chapter in their kingdom's proud history. None of them realized they were only moments away from seeing the first crack appear in a secret that had survived for 18 years. High above the cheering crowd, King Adrian Hawthorne stood on the palace balcony dressed in a dark navy ceremonial uniform trimmed with silver embroidery. At 34 years old, he carried himself with quiet confidence rather than theatrical authority. His steady blue eyes moved across the celebration below, yet his expression remained thoughtful instead of joyful. The people believed he was simply honoring tradition, but only a handful of trusted advisors knew that every annual ceremony reminded him of the kingdom's greatest unanswered mystery. 18 years earlier, on the very same morning, the infant princess had vanished without a trace before anyone could explain how such an impossible event had occurred. Official records described the tragedy as a heartbreaking accident. King Adrian had never fully believed that explanation. Far below the royal balcony, hidden among dozens of palace servants preparing decorations for the celebration, 18-year-old Ava Ashford carefully carried a polished silver tray through the enormous entrance hall. She kept her eyes lowered, her movements graceful, and her voice almost silent. Years of serving one noble household after another had taught her that remaining unnoticed often brought the safest day. She wore a simple gray servant's dress with neatly tied brown hair resting against her shoulders, while a faded scarf covered the small birthmark just below her collarbone, a mark she had hidden since childhood without ever understanding why the elderly woman who raised her insisted it must never be seen. Ava had never questioned her ordinary life. She believed she had been abandoned as an infant and later purchased into household service before eventually being assigned to work inside the royal palace itself. Although the work was exhausting, she found comfort in simple moments. Greeting kind kitchen workers before sunrise, arranging fresh flowers beneath stained glass windows, and quietly admiring the palace gardens she could never truly call her own. To everyone around her, she was simply another servant whose name would soon be forgotten by history. As the royal procession entered the grand hall, every servant stepped aside while nobles dressed in brilliant ceremonial robes filled the enormous chamber beneath crystal chandeliers and soaring marble arches. At the center of the room rested an ancient royal relic displayed upon a carved stone pedestal. According to tradition, the crystal crest symbolized the enduring strength of the royal bloodline and had remained silent for generations. The High Chancellor began the annual blessing while hundreds of guests watched respectfully. Ava lowered her head and carefully crossed the polished marble floor, carrying fresh linen toward the banquet tables. The instant she stepped within a few feet of the crystal crest, a warm golden light quietly spread through the ancient relic. At first, only a faint shimmer appeared beneath its smooth surface. Then the entire crystal suddenly illuminated the hall with brilliant golden radiance, reflecting across every polished column and stained glass window. Conversation stopped instantly. Musicians lowered their instruments. Nobles stared in stunned silence. Even the royal guards exchanged confused glances as no one could remember witnessing the sacred relic respond to anyone in living memory. Ava froze where she stood, unaware that every eye inside the grand hall had turned toward the quiet servant girl whose ordinary life had just become impossible to ignore. The silence inside the grand hall lingered for several long seconds after the crystal crest released its brilliant golden light, as though the palace itself had forgotten how to breathe. Ava Ashford remained frozen in place, her hands still holding the polished silver tray while hundreds of unfamiliar eyes settled upon her with growing confusion. She looked around the enormous chamber, searching for someone else who might have caused the extraordinary event, but every noble, every servant, every royal guard, and every member of the court was looking only at her. The warm glow slowly faded from the ancient relic until the crystal became perfectly still once again. leaving behind nothing except unanswered questions and an uneasy stillness that no one dared interrupt. The High Chancellor finally stepped closer to the pedestal, carefully examining the crystal crest from every angle before quietly assuring the gathering that the ceremony would continue. Although his voice remained calm, the uncertainty in his expression betrayed the confidence he had displayed only moments earlier. King Adrian Hawthorne watched the servant girl from the royal platform with thoughtful curiosity rather than suspicion. During his years on the throne, he had studied every surviving record concerning the sacred relic, and none described it reacting without reason. According to the oldest royal chronicles, the crystal crest recognized only those connected to the kingdom's founding bloodline. Yet standing before him was an ordinary young servant whose existence should have carried no significance whatsoever. As musicians reluctantly resumed the celebration and conversations cautiously returned, Ava quietly lowered her head and hurried from the grand hall, hoping to disappear before anyone questioned her. She crossed the long marble corridors and slipped into the palace kitchens where familiar sounds of boiling pots, fresh bread, and hurried footsteps usually brought comfort. Instead, whispers followed her from every corner. Some servants believed she had been blessed by extraordinary fortune. Others feared she had unknowingly awakened something ancient. Ava understood none of it. She had touched nothing. She had spoken to no one. She had simply walked across the room as she had done countless times before. That evening, after the celebration ended, she returned to the small servant quarters tucked beneath the eastern wing of the palace. Her room contained little more than a narrow wooden bed, a small table, and a single window overlooking the distant mountains. It had never felt luxurious, but it had always felt safe. Sitting quietly beside the window, Ava untied the faded scarf around her neck before studying the unusual birthmark resting just below her collarbone. The elderly woman who had raised her had always warned her to keep it hidden, saying only that some truths became dangerous when seen by the wrong people. Ava had accepted those words as simple caution during childhood, yet after everything that had happened inside the grand hall, they suddenly carried an entirely different meaning. Exhausted from the long day, she eventually closed her eyes, but peaceful sleep never came. Instead, unfamiliar dreams unfolded with astonishing clarity. She saw a magnificent nursery bathed in warm candlelight, where elegant royal banners decorated the walls. She heard a gentle lullaby sung by a woman whose face remained hidden behind soft morning light. A tiny golden crown rested beside an ornate cradle carved with the same intricate symbols she had seen surrounding the crystal crest. Then the dream shifted. The comforting warmth disappeared, replaced by hurried footsteps echoing through dark corridors as distant voices desperately called for someone they could not find. Before Ava could understand what she was seeing, the vision faded completely. She awoke before sunrise with tears resting quietly upon her cheeks despite having no memory that belonged to her own life. Outside her small window, the first light of dawn touched the palace towers while, far above, King Adrian stood alone in the royal library, studying an 18-year-old map spread across his desk, unable to ignore the growing certainty that the impossible event inside the grand hall had reopened a mystery the kingdom had buried far too soon. The morning after the extraordinary ceremony, the palace appeared unchanged, yet beneath its polished marble halls and carefully rehearsed traditions, uncertainty quietly spread from one corridor to another. Servants whispered while arranging breakfast tables, royal advisors spoke in lowered voices behind closed doors, and every member of the court seemed to have created a different explanation for the impossible light that had filled the grand hall. Some believed the ancient crystal crest had reacted to a forgotten prophecy. Others insisted the event had been nothing more than a rare coincidence. King Adrian Hawthorne accepted neither conclusion. Before the palace fully awakened, he entered the royal archives beneath the western tower, a place few people were permitted to visit. Dust-covered towering shelves filled with centuries of journals, maps, family records, and handwritten chronicles carefully preserved since the kingdom's founding. An elderly archivist unlocked a heavy oak cabinet containing documents sealed nearly 2 decades earlier. Adrian gently unfolded a faded parchment marked with the royal crest and studied the final official report concerning the disappearance of the infant princess. Every page repeated the same conclusion. The child had vanished during a palace celebration, leaving no evidence, no witnesses, and no explanation. Yet one detail continued to trouble him. Several names listed among those present that evening had quietly disappeared from later royal records, as though entire lives had been erased from history. Adrian carefully compared signatures, dates, and attendance lists before realizing another disturbing inconsistency. The nurse assigned to protect the princess had never been officially questioned. Instead, her records simply ended. Closing the old journal, he looked toward the morning sunlight streaming through the narrow stone windows. After 18 years, the mystery no longer seemed impossible to solve. It seemed deliberately unfinished. Meanwhile, Ava Ashford resumed her daily responsibilities exactly as she always had. She swept palace hallways, polished silver serving pieces, arranged fresh flowers inside reception rooms, and greeted other servants with quiet kindness despite feeling the weight of countless curious glances. She wanted nothing more than an ordinary day, yet ordinary moments now felt strangely unfamiliar. While replacing flowers inside a long gallery lined with portraits of former kings and queens, she paused before a magnificent painting of Queen Eleanor, the beloved ruler who had disappeared from public life shortly after the infant princess vanished. Ava stared quietly at the queen's gentle smile, overcome by an unexpected feeling she could not explain. It did not feel like admiration for a historical figure. It felt painfully personal, as though she had once known the warmth hidden behind those painted eyes. A sudden ache settled deep within her chest before another brief memory flashed across her mind. She imagined tiny hands reaching toward the same smiling woman while soft laughter echoed through a sunlit room. The vision vanished almost instantly, leaving Ava standing motionless before the portrait with tears she could not understand. Startled by her own emotions, she stepped away before anyone noticed. That afternoon, King Adrian requested a private meeting with his closest advisor, Sir Nathaniel Brooks, a man who had served both the previous king and the current crown with unwavering loyalty. After listening carefully to Adrian's observations, Nathaniel spoke with unusual caution. "Your Majesty, if the Crystal Crest truly recognized that young servant, then we must consider possibilities that most people would refuse to believe." Adrian nodded slowly. "That is exactly why we cannot allow rumors to guide us. We need evidence." Nathaniel hesitated before opening a small leather notebook. "There is one person still alive who served inside the royal nursery 18 years ago. She disappeared shortly after the tragedy and has never returned to the capital." Adrian looked up immediately. "Find her." As the afternoon sunlight faded beyond the palace towers, neither man realized that somewhere beyond the capital walls, an elderly woman had already begun her long journey back toward the kingdom, carrying a truth she had protected in silence for 18 years. 3 days passed, yet the unusual event inside the grand hall continued to linger over the palace like an unanswered question that refused to disappear. Life appeared to return to normal on the surface. Courtiers attended meetings, servants carried out their daily responsibilities, and visitors filled the palace with polite conversations. Beneath the calm routine, however, King Adrian Hawthorne quietly expanded his investigation while carefully keeping it hidden from the public. Only Sir Nathaniel Brooks knew how deeply the king had begun questioning every official account written 18 years earlier. Beyond the capital, a small horse-drawn carriage slowly approached the city gates along a winding mountain road. Sitting quietly inside was an elderly woman wrapped in a simple gray traveling cloak. Time had placed gentle lines upon her face, yet her clear eyes remained sharp with quiet determination. Few people remembered Eleanor Whitmore, the former royal nurse who had once cared for the infant princess before vanishing without explanation shortly after the tragedy. For 18 years, she had lived in peaceful isolation, believing silence was the only way to protect a child whose life had depended upon remaining forgotten. Everything changed the moment travelers passing through a nearby village spoke about an impossible event inside the royal palace. They described an ancient crystal crest shining with brilliant golden light before an ordinary servant girl. Eleanor had listened without interrupting, but her hands began trembling almost immediately. There had only ever been one child capable of awakening that sacred relic. By the time the conversation ended, she had already decided to return to the capital for the first time in nearly 2 decades. Meanwhile, Ava Ashford continued serving inside the palace while trying to ignore the growing curiosity surrounding her. She avoided unnecessary attention and devoted herself to ordinary responsibilities, hoping the whispers would eventually disappear. That afternoon, she was assigned to organize old linen stored inside a quiet room rarely visited by anyone except senior staff. As she carried folded fabric toward a wooden cabinet, the faded scarf around her neck loosened and slipped gently onto the floor without her noticing. The small birthmark beneath her collarbone was suddenly visible for the first time in years. At that exact moment, an elderly visitor entered the room after being escorted through the servants' corridor while waiting for permission to meet the king. Eleanor stopped walking as though time itself had frozen. Her eyes rested upon the birthmark, a delicate shape resembling the royal crest surrounded by tiny curved lines that she had once seen every single day while caring for the infant princess. The folded blanket slipped from Ava's hands as she noticed the stranger staring at her with overwhelming emotion. Embarrassed, she quickly reached for the scarf and covered the mark once again. "I am sorry," Ava said softly. "Did I do something wrong?" Eleanor struggled to answer. Tears quietly filled her eyes before she gently shook her head. "No," she whispered. "You have done nothing wrong." Her voice carried such deep sadness and relief that Ava could not understand it. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. Eleanor wanted nothing more than to embrace the young servant standing before her. Yet she knew revealing the truth too quickly could place them both in danger before the facts were fully uncovered. Gathering her composure, she simply asked, "May I know your name?" "Ava Ashford," she replied politely. Eleanor smiled with quiet tenderness, but inside her heart another name echoed louder than any words she could safely speak. As Ava left the room carrying fresh linens, Eleanor remained standing alone, her hands trembling once again. She had spent 18 years protecting a secret she believed would remain buried forever. Now, after seeing the unmistakable royal birthmark with her own eyes, she understood that the lost princess had not only survived. She had been living inside the palace all along, hidden in plain sight beneath the very roof where her true story had first begun. That evening, the palace settled into an uneasy calm, but behind its magnificent walls, quiet decisions were already beginning to reshape the future of the kingdom. Eleanor Whitmore remained inside a private guest chamber reserved for trusted visitors, her thoughts consumed by the young servant whose face and hidden birthmark had awakened memories she had struggled to silence for 18 years. She understood that one mistaken accusation could destroy an innocent life, yet remaining silent any longer would allow an even greater injustice to continue. Before requesting an audience with King Adrian Hawthorne, she decided there was one final truth she needed to confirm with her own eyes. Early the next morning, while the palace corridors were still peaceful, Eleanor quietly returned to the eastern wing, where palace servants began their daily work before sunrise. Ava Ashford was arranging fresh flowers beneath tall, stained glass windows when she noticed the elderly woman approaching with a warm but thoughtful smile. Eleanor offered to help carry a basket filled with white lilies, and together they slowly walked through the silent corridor. Their conversation began with ordinary questions about daily life, yet Eleanor carefully observed every small detail. Ava spoke with kindness toward everyone she mentioned, never complained about years of difficult work, and showed a quiet grace that reminded Eleanor of another young woman she had once served with unwavering devotion. As they reached a quiet courtyard filled with blooming roses, Eleanor gently asked, "Do you remember anything about your parents?" Ava lowered her eyes before softly shaking her head. "Only what I was told. The woman who raised me said I had been left in her care as a baby. She never spoke about where I came from, only that I should always keep my birthmark hidden because one day someone might ask questions neither of us could answer." Eleanor's heart grew heavier with every word. She knew those were the same instructions she herself had given to the elderly widow who had secretly protected the child all those years ago. The past she had buried was slowly returning piece by piece. While Ava returned to her responsibilities, Eleanor quietly made her way toward the royal archives, where King Adrian and Sir Nathaniel Brooks had already begun examining sealed historical records. The king welcomed her respectfully before inviting her to sit beside a large oak table covered with faded maps, royal family trees, and handwritten journals. Eleanor carefully removed a small cloth bundle she had carried throughout her journey. Inside rested a tiny silver bracelet engraved with the royal crest and the initials of the infant princess. "I kept this because I hoped one day the truth would matter more than fear," she said quietly. Adrian examined the bracelet with great care before comparing it to official palace records. Every engraving matched perfectly. Encouraged by the discovery, Sir Nathaniel searched through another collection of forgotten documents stored inside a locked cabinet that had not been opened for years. Hidden beneath routine financial records, he uncovered several missing registry pages that had never appeared in the official archives. As the three carefully examined each page, a disturbing pattern slowly emerged. Dates had been altered. Witness signatures had disappeared. The transfer records for several palace employees had been deliberately rewritten only days after the infant princess vanished. Even more troubling, the woman who officially claimed responsibility for the child had never existed according to tax records or census rolls. She had been invented on paper to replace the real caretaker. King Adrian quietly closed the final document and looked toward Eleanor. "Someone did not simply hide a child," he said with calm certainty. "Someone rewrote history." Eleanor slowly nodded. "And if they changed the records once, they may still be protecting that lie today." Outside the archive windows, the afternoon sun illuminated the palace towers as if nothing had changed. Yet within the quiet room, every newly uncovered page brought the kingdom one step closer to exposing a truth that powerful hands had spent 18 years trying to erase forever. The discoveries hidden inside the royal archives changed everything for King Adrian Hawthorne, yet they answered almost none of the questions that mattered most. Someone had deliberately rewritten official records, erased witnesses, and replaced real names with fabricated identities. But every false document only pointed toward a larger conspiracy that had been carefully maintained for nearly 2 decades. Rather than announcing his findings, Adrian chose patience. If powerful people had protected the secret for 18 years, they would almost certainly attempt to hide whatever evidence still remained. He instructed Sir Nathaniel Brooks to continue examining forgotten records while Eleanor Whitmore remained safely inside the palace under the protection of the royal household. Only 4 people now knew how close the kingdom might be to uncovering its greatest hidden truth. Unaware of the investigation quietly unfolding around her, Ava Ashford continued her ordinary routine with the same humility she had always shown. She carried fresh linens through the palace corridors, arranged flowers inside reception halls, and prepared guest chambers for visiting dignitaries. Although whispers still followed her after the crystal crest had responded during the ceremony, no one openly questioned her. She almost convinced herself that life had finally begun returning to normal. Late that afternoon, however, the head steward approached with unexpected instructions. "His Majesty requires additional refreshments inside the Western Library," he said politely. "Take the tea service there immediately." Ava nodded respectfully before carefully preparing a silver tray with freshly brewed tea, warm bread, and seasonal fruit. She had never entered the Western Library before. Unlike the magnificent public halls of the palace, this room felt quiet and deeply personal. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves surrounded a large stone fireplace, while sunlight poured through tall windows overlooking the royal gardens. Ancient maps, leather-bound journals, and carefully preserved historical documents covered a massive oak table near the center of the room. King Adrian stood alone studying several faded parchments when Ava quietly entered. She lowered her head respectfully before placing the tray upon a nearby table. "Your Majesty," she said softly, preparing to leave without disturbing his work. "Please wait," Adrian replied with calm kindness rather than authority. Ava stopped immediately, uncertain whether she had made a mistake. Adrian looked toward her with thoughtful curiosity, remembering the impossible moment when the crystal crest had filled the grand hall with light. "I realized we have never properly met," he said. "What is your name?" "Ava Ashford, Your Majesty." Adrian repeated her name quietly, as though committing it to memory. "How long have you served inside the palace?" "Almost 3 years, Your Majesty. Before that I worked for several noble households outside the capital." Adrian nodded thoughtfully before asking another gentle question. "Have you always lived within this kingdom?" Ava hesitated for only a moment. "As far as I know, yes. I do not remember my earliest childhood." The woman who raised me rarely spoke about those years. Adrian noticed the uncertainty in her voice. There was no sign of deception, only honest confusion from someone searching for answers she had never been given. Before the conversation could continue, a sudden breeze drifted through the open windows, scattering several loose documents across the floor. Ava instinctively stepped forward to help gather the pages before they disappeared beneath nearby shelves. As she reached for one faded parchment, her eyes briefly rested upon an old charcoal sketch lying among the historical records. It showed a smiling young queen gently holding an infant wrapped in an embroidered blanket. Without understanding why, Ava felt an overwhelming warmth spread through her heart. The image looked strangely familiar, as though she had seen it somewhere long before memory itself. She carefully handed the sketch back to Adrian, who quietly observed the emotion crossing her face. "Have you seen that portrait before?" he asked. Ava slowly shook her head. "No, Your Majesty, but it somehow feels like I should remember it." Adrian accepted the drawing without another word. Yet after Ava quietly left the library, he remained standing beside the window holding the old portrait in one hand while looking toward the palace gardens below. For the first time since reopening the forgotten investigation, he no longer believed he was searching only for the kingdom's lost princess. He had begun searching for the truth hidden inside the memories of the young woman whose life had been shaped by secrets she had never known. The days that followed unfolded with an uneasy stillness, as though the palace itself sensed that the truth had begun moving beneath its polished floors. King Adrian Hawthorne deliberately avoided drawing attention to his investigation, allowing court life to continue exactly as it always had. Public ceremonies resumed, noble families attended formal gatherings, and visiting ambassadors admired the beauty of the royal residence without realizing that a mystery buried for 18 years was quietly beginning to awaken. Behind closed doors, however, Adrian, Sir Nathaniel Brooks, and Eleanor Whitmore continued searching through forgotten journals, sealed correspondence, and neglected architectural records. One faded map caught Sir Nathaniel's attention. It showed an abandoned section beneath the oldest part of the palace that no longer appeared on modern floor plans. According to handwritten notes in the margin, the chamber had once been used to safeguard ceremonial treasures connected to the founding royal family before being permanently sealed many years earlier. Intrigued by the discovery, Adrian decided the forgotten chamber should be examined before anyone else learned of its existence. Late that evening, accompanied only by Sir Nathaniel and Eleanor, he quietly descended a narrow spiral staircase hidden behind an ancient bookshelf inside the Western Library. Dust covered every stone step, and the air carried the scent of age rather than neglect. At the bottom of the staircase, they discovered a heavy oak door reinforced with bronze hinges that had not been opened for many years. With careful effort, they slowly pushed it inward. Inside waited a circular stone chamber illuminated only by the soft glow of lantern light. Shelves carved into the walls held ceremonial objects wrapped in protective cloth, while faded banners bearing the earliest royal crest hung motionless above them. At the very center of the room rested a beautifully crafted crystal sphere supported by an intricately carved marble pedestal. Eleanor immediately recognized it. "The crown beacon," she whispered. "It was created generations before the crystal crest. Only members of the founding bloodline were ever permitted to stand before it." Adrian stepped closer, studying the remarkable artifact without touching it. Time had left the crystal perfectly preserved, its smooth surface reflecting the lantern light like calm water. Eleanor explained that the beacon had not been used since long before Adrian's grandfather became king, because later rulers considered the crystal crest sufficient for ceremonial purposes. Sir Nathaniel carefully searched nearby shelves until he discovered an old journal describing the beacon's purpose. According to the handwritten account, it responded not to titles or status, but to inherited royal lineage. Adrian quietly closed the journal. "Then we cannot test it ourselves," he said. "If the records are correct, there is only one person who may answer the question we have been asking." The following afternoon, completely unaware of the hidden chamber beneath the palace, Ava Ashford was assigned to clean a quiet hallway near the Western Library after most officials had finished their meetings. As she carefully polished the tall windows overlooking the royal gardens, Eleanor approached with gentle warmth. "Ava," she said kindly, Would you help me carry several books that have become far too heavy for me? Ava smiled politely and agreed without hesitation. Together, they entered the Western Library before making their way toward the concealed doorway hidden behind towering bookshelves. Ava believed they were simply delivering old manuscripts for storage. She had no idea that every step brought her closer to the forgotten chamber beneath the palace. As the hidden door slowly opened once again, a faint golden shimmer quietly spread across the smooth surface of the ancient crown beacon long before anyone invited Ava inside, and Eleanor exchanged a silent glance with King Adrian, both realizing that some ancient truths no longer waited for permission to reveal themselves. As Ava Ashford stepped across the threshold of the forgotten chamber beneath the Western Library, an extraordinary silence settled over the ancient room. The heavy oak door slowly closed behind her, muffling every sound from the palace above until only the gentle crackle of lantern flames remained. She paused for a moment, unsure why King Adrian Hawthorne, Sir Nathaniel Brooks, and Eleanor Whitmore had brought her to a place that felt untouched by time itself. Massive stone walls surrounded the circular chamber, decorated with faded banners bearing the earliest royal crest, while shelves displayed ceremonial objects that had not seen daylight for generations. At the center of the room rested the crystal beacon upon its carved marble pedestal, its smooth surface already glowing with a faint golden warmth that had not been present only moments earlier. Ava looked around with quiet uncertainty. "Your Majesty," she asked softly, "am I supposed to be here?" Adrian answered with reassuring calm. "We are simply trying to understand something that none of us can yet explain." Eleanor smiled gently, hoping to ease Ava's growing nervousness. "There is nothing to fear." Encouraged by their kindness, Ava slowly stepped farther into the chamber. The instant she came within a few feet of the crystal beacon, the ancient artifact responded with breathtaking brilliance. Golden light flowed through the crystal like sunlight passing across clear water before expanding into delicate streams that illuminated every carved symbol throughout the chamber. The faded royal banners seemed almost alive beneath the warm radiance, while tiny golden reflections danced across the stone walls. No one spoke. Sir Nathaniel quietly lowered the journal he had been holding, unable to hide his astonishment. Eleanor closed her eyes for a brief moment as tears of relief gathered once again. She had prayed for years that the truth would one day reveal itself without hatred or conflict. King Adrian stood perfectly still, watching the impossible scene unfold before him. According to every surviving historical record, the crystal beacon recognized only descendants of the founding royal bloodline. It had remained silent for generations because no direct heir had ever stood before it since the ancient ceremony that introduced each royal child to the kingdom. Ava herself stared at the glowing crystal in complete disbelief. She had touched nothing. She had spoken no ancient words. Yet the beacon continued shining as though welcoming someone it had patiently awaited for 18 years. Then something even stranger happened. As Ava looked into the center of the crystal, faint reflections slowly appeared within its light. She could not clearly see faces, but she recognized a magnificent nursery filled with warm sunlight, elegant white curtains moving gently beside tall windows, and a smiling woman reaching toward a tiny child wrapped in a royal blue blanket embroidered with silver thread. A familiar lullaby echoed softly through the chamber, the very same melody she had heard in her dreams. The vision lasted only a few seconds before fading as gently as it had appeared. Ava stepped backward, overwhelmed by emotions she could not explain. "I have seen that room before," she whispered, "but I do not know how." Eleanor looked toward Adrian with quiet certainty. "Those are not dreams," she said softly. "They are memories." Adrian carefully approached the crystal beacon, studying the ancient symbols now glowing around its base. Among them, he noticed an inscription hidden beneath centuries of dust. Sir Nathaniel gently brushed away the remaining dirt until the carved words became visible. The inscription read, "Truth waits patiently for those who cannot erase blood." The four stood together in thoughtful silence, realizing the palace had now offered them two undeniable signs pointing toward the same impossible conclusion. Yet somewhere above them, beyond the hidden chamber, unseen eyes had already begun noticing unusual movements inside the Western Library, and before another sunrise arrived, Someone else would quietly begin searching for the truth they had spent 18 years making certain no one would ever discover. After leaving the hidden chamber beneath the Western Library, none of them spoke for several minutes. The silence carried greater meaning than any conversation could have expressed. King Adrian Hawthorne understood that the crystal beacon had confirmed what history, forgotten records, and Eleanor Whitmore's memories had been quietly revealing piece by piece. Yet, even with two sacred artifacts recognizing Ava Ashford, he refused to announce conclusions without evidence that no one could challenge. If the kingdom was to finally learn the truth, every unanswered question had to be supported by facts stronger than rumor or emotion. Ava returned to her modest servant quarters carrying emotions she could not explain. Throughout the evening, the vision inside the crystal beacon refused to leave her thoughts. The elegant nursery, the warm sunlight, the embroidered blue blanket, and the gentle lullaby all felt painfully familiar. As she sat beside the small window overlooking the palace courtyard, she removed the faded scarf from around her neck and carefully studied the unusual birthmark reflected in a polished silver tray. For years she had treated it as nothing more than a strange mark that needed to remain hidden. Now it seemed connected to memories buried deeper than she had ever imagined. That night sleep came slowly, and when dreams finally arrived, they were clearer than ever before. She saw herself as a tiny child laughing while reaching toward a woman with kind blue eyes wearing a graceful silver crown. A man stood nearby smiling proudly as sunlight filled the room. Someone gently placed the same silver bracelet Eleanor had shown the king around the child's tiny wrist before another pair of unfamiliar hands hurriedly lifted the little girl into a warm blanket. The dream shifted as hurried footsteps echoed through quiet hallways, followed by a soft voice repeating the same words again and again. "Forgive me. One day you will know who you truly are." Ava suddenly awoke before sunrise with tears quietly resting upon her cheeks. She could still hear the voice as clearly as if someone had whispered beside her bed only seconds earlier. Unable to ignore the growing questions inside her heart, she quietly made her way to the palace gardens before beginning her daily responsibilities. The peaceful morning air usually brought comfort, but today even the blooming flowers seemed strangely familiar. While walking along an old stone path rarely used by visitors, she noticed a weathered marble fountain decorated with the same founding crest she had seen inside the hidden chamber. Without thinking, she gently placed her fingertips upon the carved symbol. Another brief memory flashed through her mind. She saw herself as a laughing little girl running around the very same fountain while a woman called her by a name she could not fully hear. Before the memory disappeared, one single word became unmistakably clear. "Princess." Ava immediately stepped backward, her heart racing with confusion. She looked around the empty garden, wondering whether grief, imagination, or exhaustion had begun creating impossible illusions. Unknown to her, King Adrian had been observing quietly from a nearby terrace after noticing her unusual behavior. He did not approach or interrupt her. Instead, he watched as Ava instinctively reached once more toward the ancient fountain, almost as though her heart remembered the palace long before her mind could understand it. At that same moment, Sir Nathaniel Brooks hurried across the courtyard carrying another bundle of forgotten documents recovered from an abandoned storage room beneath the Eastern Tower. Among the fragile papers rested an old hand-drawn map of the royal nursery with detailed notes describing a hidden escape passage leading away from the palace on the very night the infant princess disappeared. Carefully folded inside the map was a single faded letter bearing no signature, only one haunting sentence written in elegant handwriting. "The child lives because the kingdom must first survive the lie." As Adrian slowly read those words, he realized the conspiracy surrounding the missing princess had never been driven by simple disappearance alone. Someone had deliberately sacrificed one innocent life of certainty to protect a secret powerful enough to shape the destiny of the entire kingdom. The evidence gathered over the previous days could no longer remain hidden within locked archives and forgotten chambers. King Adrian Hawthorne understood that the moment had arrived to present the truth before the Royal Council, the highest governing body in Evermont, whose approval would determine whether decades of official history would remain unchanged or finally be corrected. Rather than making a sudden announcement, Adrian ordered a formal council session to be held inside the Great Assembly Hall, inviting senior nobles, royal advisors, judges, and respected scholars responsible for preserving the kingdom's historical records. News of the unexpected gathering spread quickly throughout the palace, leaving everyone wondering what matter required the personal attendance of so many influential figures. Ava Ashford received no explanation. She simply continued her ordinary duties until a royal messenger approached with an invitation that surprised everyone nearby. "His Majesty requests your presence at the Assembly Hall," the messenger said respectfully. Confused but obedient, Ava followed him through the magnificent palace corridors, unaware that countless curious eyes quietly followed her every step. When she entered the Assembly Hall, she immediately noticed rows of distinguished council members seated beneath towering banners representing every province of the kingdom. At the far end of the chamber, King Adrian stood beside Sir Nathaniel Brooks and Eleanor Whitmore, while several carefully protected wooden cases rested upon a long table covered with royal blue velvet. The atmosphere felt serious yet calm. Adrian welcomed the council before speaking with measured confidence. "For 18 years, he began, our kingdom has accepted a version of history supported by official records. Today I present evidence suggesting those records were deliberately altered." A quiet murmur spread across the chamber before disappearing once more. Adrian opened the first wooden case, revealing the engraved silver bracelet recovered from Eleanor. Historical experts immediately confirmed the royal craftsmanship and ceremonial markings unique to the missing infant princess. The second case contained the missing registry pages recovered from the archives, showing altered dates, erased witness signatures, and fabricated identities that replaced genuine palace employees. Sir Nathaniel carefully explained how every forged document matched inconsistencies discovered throughout multiple independent records preserved in separate locations. Finally, Eleanor stepped forward with quiet dignity. She shared her testimony without anger or accusation, describing the night she had carried the infant princess away from immediate danger under instructions intended to protect the child's life until the truth could safely return. Every detail she described aligned perfectly with the recovered documents and architectural maps showing the hidden escape passage beneath the royal nursery. The council listened in complete silence. Then Adrian turned toward Ava, who remained standing near the entrance, overwhelmed by everything unfolding before her. "There remains one final question," he said gently. "Not whether history was changed, but whether the child who disappeared survived." He invited Ava to approach the center of the chamber. Nervously, she obeyed. Adrian placed the ancient crystal beacon upon a ceremonial pedestal brought from the hidden chamber beneath the palace. The assembly hall grew perfectly still as Ava stepped closer. Once again, without anyone touching the artifact or speaking a single ancient word, warm golden light slowly awakened inside the crystal before expanding throughout the hall with the same unmistakable brilliance witnessed beneath the Western Library. Gasps echoed softly among the assembled council members. Several elderly scholars immediately recognized the phenomenon described only in the oldest royal chronicles. Adrian allowed the light to fade naturally before speaking once more. "Artifacts may inspire belief," he said calmly. "But today they stand beside testimony, historical records, physical evidence, and surviving witnesses. Together they tell one consistent story." Ava looked around the magnificent hall with tears quietly filling her eyes, realizing that every unanswered question from her childhood had led to this single extraordinary moment. Yet as the council members prepared to begin formal deliberations, one elderly noble slowly rose from his seat with an expression impossible to read before asking a single question that caused the entire chamber to fall silent once again. "If the princess truly survived," he said carefully, "who benefited from convincing the kingdom that she had vanished?" The elderly noble's question echoed through the great assembly hall long after his voice had fallen silent. Every council member understood that discovering the identity of the missing princess answered only part of the mystery. The greater question remained: who had benefited from allowing an innocent child to disappear from history while the kingdom accepted a carefully constructed lie for 18 years? King Adrian Hawthorne looked calmly across the chamber before answering with complete honesty. That is the question we have spent days trying to answer, he said. The evidence reveals deliberate deception, but it does not reveal a single mastermind. What it reveals instead is a chain of silence maintained by fear, loyalty, and decisions made during a time of uncertainty. Adrian then instructed Sir Nathaniel Brooks to present the final collection of recovered documents. One by one, the forgotten letters, financial records, registry corrections, and administrative orders were carefully arranged before the council. Together, they revealed an extraordinary pattern. No document ordered the disappearance of the infant princess. Instead, every alteration had been made afterward by different officials attempting to protect what they believed was the stability of the kingdom. Some feared political conflict if uncertainty surrounded the royal succession. Others believed that publicly admitting the princess had survived after years of declaring her lost would destroy confidence in the crown. Each official had altered only a small piece of history, believing someone else knew the complete truth. Over time, those separate decisions merged into a single false history accepted by an entire generation. Eleanor Whitmore slowly stepped forward once more. "No one asked me to abandon the princess," she said quietly. "I was asked to save her because there were fears that unknown people were searching for the royal child. I believed I would return within days. Instead, every message I attempted to send disappeared, and every familiar face inside the palace vanished from public life. Eventually, I realized that those still holding authority believed the kingdom could only survive if everyone accepted that the princess had been lost forever." The council listened with solemn attention. Several elderly members lowered their heads, recognizing that some of the signatures appearing on the altered records belonged to respected officials who had long since passed away. Their intentions could no longer be questioned directly, but the surviving evidence revealed that fear rather than ambition had gradually buried the truth beneath layers of silence. King Adrian then turned toward Ava Ashford. "You were never abandoned because you lacked value," he said with calm sincerity. "You were hidden because too many people believed protecting the kingdom required sacrificing your identity. They were wrong." Ava struggled to hold back her emotions as years of unanswered loneliness finally began making painful sense. She had spent her entire life believing she belonged nowhere, never realizing that countless decisions made by strangers before she could even speak had shaped every year that followed. The council requested a brief private deliberation before returning to the assembly hall less than an hour later. The Chief Justice rose from his seat, carrying the official record of their unanimous decision. After examining the testimony, surviving witnesses, authenticated historical documents, ceremonial artifacts, and corroborating evidence, he announced, "The Royal Council formally recognizes that the official history concerning the disappearance of the infant princess was materially inaccurate. The council unanimously acknowledges Ava Ashford as the surviving royal heir born into the House of Hawthorne." A profound silence filled the hall before every council member slowly stood in respectful recognition. No celebration erupted. No voices shouted. The moment carried something greater than excitement. It carried the quiet restoration of truth. As Ava looked across the chamber toward King Adrian, she realized that she had not gained a new life that day. She had finally been given back the life that had always belonged to her. And for the first time in 18 years, the history of Evermont no longer belonged to a carefully protected lie, but to the truth that had patiently waited for the courage to be spoken aloud. The days following the Royal Council's decision marked the beginning of a new chapter unlike anything Evermont had experienced in generations. Throughout the capital, official proclamations were carefully delivered, not as dramatic announcements, but as truthful corrections to the kingdom's history. Citizens gathered in marketplaces, village squares, and along quiet streets as royal messengers explained that the long-lost princess had been found alive after years of mistaken records and forgotten evidence. Many listened with surprise, others with disbelief, but as respected scholars, council members, and witnesses confirmed the same account, uncertainty gradually gave way to quiet acceptance. Inside the palace, however, the greatest transformation belonged not to the kingdom, but to Ava Ashford herself. Although everyone now addressed her with the respect due to a royal heir, she found the sudden change difficult to understand. Only days earlier she had carried linens through these same corridors without anyone noticing her. Now every servant bowed politely, Every royal guard stood at attention, and every official greeted her with careful courtesy. The kindness touched her deeply, yet she quietly wondered whether she truly deserved a place she had never expected to claim. Sensing her uncertainty, King Adrian Hawthorne invited Ava to walk with him through the royal gardens before sunset. They followed familiar stone pathways lined with blooming white roses until they reached the old marble fountain where Ava had experienced the mysterious memory only days before. Adrian stopped beside the water before speaking gently. "A title cannot change the person you became," he said. "For 18 years you learned compassion without privilege, patience without recognition, and dignity without reward. Those qualities cannot be taught inside a palace. You already possess them because of the life you lived." Ava looked toward the peaceful fountain as the evening light reflected across its surface. "I still feel like the same servant," she admitted quietly. Adrian smiled with quiet understanding. "That is exactly why this kingdom will one day trust you." His words settled gently within her heart. For the first time since learning the truth, Ava realized she did not have to choose between the life she remembered and the life she had inherited. Both had shaped the person she had become. Over the following weeks, Eleanor Whitmore helped Ava learn the traditions, history, and responsibilities that had once been meant for her childhood. Rather than focusing on ceremony alone, Eleanor shared stories about Queen Eleanor's kindness, her devotion to the people, and her belief that every ruler should first understand ordinary lives before making extraordinary decisions. Ava listened carefully, often recognizing values she had unknowingly practiced throughout her years as a servant. Meanwhile, King Adrian ordered the royal archives to restore every altered record connected to the missing princess. False entries were preserved only as historical evidence, while accurate accounts replaced the official history taught to future generations. The hidden chamber beneath the Western Library was carefully protected, and the crystal beacon returned to its place of honor as a symbol that truth might wait patiently but would never disappear forever. One bright autumn morning, members of the royal council, palace staff, and citizens gathered peacefully within the grand hall where the crystal crest had first responded to Ava's presence. This time there were no whispers, no uncertainty, and no hidden questions. Wearing an elegant but modest white ceremonial gown embroidered with the silver crest of House Hawthorne, Ava stepped forward with calm confidence. As she approached the ancient crystal crest once more, warm golden light gently filled the hall exactly as it had on the first day. But now every person present understood what that light truly represented. It was never simply recognizing royal blood. It was honoring a truth that had endured every attempt to erase it. And as the brilliant glow illuminated the faces gathered throughout the hall, Ava finally understood that her greatest inheritance was not a crown waiting in the future, but the opportunity to lead with the compassion, humility, and courage that 18 difficult years had quietly placed within her heart. Nearly 1 year passed, and the kingdom of Evermont quietly entered a season unlike any in its recent history. The restoration of the royal records had done more than correct the past. It had changed the way people looked toward the future. Farmers arriving in the capital no longer spoke only about harvests and trade. Families visiting the palace shared stories of the princess who had once walked the same streets as an ordinary servant, greeting strangers with kindness long before anyone knew her true identity. Children listening to those stories did not remember the years of uncertainty. They remembered only that truth had finally found its way home. Princess Ava Hawthorne never allowed the title she inherited to separate her from the people whose lives had shaped her own. She regularly visited schools, workshops, gardens, and village markets, often speaking with workers, teachers, craftsmen, and families without unnecessary ceremony. Many older citizens quietly smiled when they realized that although the young woman now wore elegant royal clothing, her gentle voice and thoughtful heart remained exactly the same. She still remembered every difficult lesson learned during the 18 years she had lived without knowing her real name, and those memories became the foundation of every decision she made. King Adrian Hawthorne watched those changes with quiet pride. Rather than preparing Ava only to inherit authority, he encouraged her to understand responsibility. Together they reviewed laws, listened to petitions from citizens, studied the history of neighboring kingdoms, and discussed how every choice made by the crown could shape ordinary lives for generations. Adrian often reminded her that leadership was never measured by the height of a throne, but by the trust people willingly placed in those who served them. Eleanor Whitmore continued living inside the palace, not as a forgotten witness to history, but as a beloved member of the royal household. She spent many peaceful afternoons teaching Ava songs, traditions, and stories once intended for a little princess whose childhood had been interrupted by fate. Sometimes they visited the quiet marble fountain together, where Ava's earliest memories had first begun returning. Those moments no longer brought sadness. They became gentle reminders that even years lost to silence could still lead toward hope. The hidden chamber beneath the Western Library remained carefully preserved. Scholars occasionally studied the crystal beacon and the ancient records surrounding it, ensuring that future generations would understand both the miracle of its light and the importance of protecting historical truth. Above the entrance, King Adrian ordered a new inscription to be placed beside the original words carved into stone. It read, "Truth may be delayed, but it must never be abandoned." On the anniversary of the day the Crystal Crest had first recognized Ava, citizens from every province gathered peacefully outside the palace for a celebration unlike any royal ceremony before it. There were no displays of wealth meant to impress the crowd. Instead, musicians filled the courtyards with joyful melodies. Children carried white flowers through the gardens, and families shared meals together beneath banners representing every corner of Evermont. As the evening sun painted the palace in shades of gold, Ava stepped onto the same balcony where generations of rulers had greeted the kingdom. She looked across thousands of hopeful faces before offering a warm smile filled with gratitude rather than triumph. She understood that her greatest victory had never been discovering she was born a princess. It had been learning that compassion earned through hardship possessed greater strength than privilege inherited at birth. As the first evening stars appeared above the kingdom, the crystal crest resting inside the grand hall reflected a single beam of fading sunlight that quietly spread across its surface before disappearing into the gathering twilight. It was almost as though the ancient relic itself had finally found peace. The story that began with a forgotten child raised as a servant ended not with revenge, anger, or power, but with the quiet restoration of truth, the healing of a family, and the promise that in Evermont, no lie could outlast the courage of those willing to remember who they truly were.